Welcome to the roundtable on what promises will states keep beyond national jurisdiction at the American Society of International Law's 2020 annual meeting. So this session is the final event for the Society's signature topic, Beyond National Jurisdiction, which has examined the international law governing the oceans, polar regions, cyberspace, and outer space. I'm Simi Payne, and it has been my privilege to chair the steering committee for the signature topic over the last 2 years. We have explored these areas that lie beyond the territorial jurisdiction of any state. We recognized that they present unique challenges and opportunities for international law. Through podcasts, essays, and a variety of events, we investigated how international law, transnational law, and global institutions complement national governance. In this roundtable discussion, 3 experts will discuss the possibilities for international law in light of the unique legal issues raised by these activities. I want to thank all the members of ASIL who have contributed to the success of the Beyond National Jurisdiction signature topic, especially the members of the steering committee and the co-chairs of the related interest groups. You can pursue your interest in today's discussion by visiting asil.org and going to the Beyond National Jurisdiction topic pages. And now, I'd like to introduce Brian Egan, who will moderate this roundtable. Brian is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson and former senior legal official with the White House, the National Security Council, and the Departments of State and Treasury under the Obama administration. He shared his expertise and interest, particularly in matters related to cyberspace, as a member of the steering committee for the B&J signature topic. Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Simi, and welcome to everyone. And thank you all for joining us today. We're here to discuss recent international law developments in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And as Professor Payne mentioned, this has been one of the Society's first two signature topics, overseen by a steering committee of experts that has been chaired by Professor Payne. In this signature topic, we have explored how international law governs activities beyond one state's traditional boundaries from several different aspects of international law. And these activities may take place in several domains. We have focused on the oceans, the polar regions of the world, outer space, and cyberspace. Now, there's a broad consensus amongst states, including the United States, that international law does apply to these areas beyond national jurisdiction. But the status of international law in these areas on a broad range of issues is unsettled and evolving. From the exploiting or sharing of resources to potential impact from accidents or other harms, to issues related to law enforcement or immigration, or even the law of armed conflict. Many international law topics must be addressed in considering these areas beyond national jurisdiction. So to conclude ASIL's consideration of this signature topic, we have a great group of discussants today. And first, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Stefan Kirchner, who is Associate Professor of Arctic Law and Adjunct Professor for Fundamental and Human Rights at the University of Lapland in Finland. Professor Kirchner's work has focused on the Arctic region and the impact of climate change in that region. And he's also considering resource issues in outer space. Professor Kirchner also hosts a great podcast, the Arctic Podcast, and he has been an invaluable contributor to the Society's work on this signature topic. So Stefan, thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks, Brian.
Second, we're joined by Lydia Slobodian, who is an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and the founder and director of Serova, a new organization which strives to identify and implement policy levers for transformational planetary change. She previously worked as senior legal officer for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, where she led the IUCN delegation to the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. Lydia, thank you for joining as well.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really excited to be part of this.
So as you can see, between the two discussants, We cover almost all of the topics that the signature group has gone over the last few years. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground today in our discussion as well. We've got multiple ongoing negotiations to discuss, current events to discuss, and other issues. We have 1 hour, so not a lot of time, but we're going to hit as many of these issues as we possibly can in this hour. So to start, let's talk about how current events can impact international legal issues in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Let's take the threat of climate change, for example, which is going to be one of the Society's next signature topics. This topic has significant implications for activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And starting with Lydia, can I ask each of you for your views on whether climate change is creating international law challenges or opportunities in your particular areas of focus?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Definitely, climate change is an enormous issue in the context of ocean governance. I think there are three main ways that climate change intersects with oceans. One is the impact of climate change on the ocean environment and marine biodiversity. Not just warming and sea level rise, but also deoxygenation and ocean acidification, and possibly threats that we don't even know about yet. These threats, importantly, are cumulative with existing threats, like the threats caused by overfishing and shipping. And that intersection of new and existing threats, current regimes are just not equipped to handle. Climate change also potentially creates changes in ocean processes and the behavior and even location of biodiversity, which creates a possible need for dynamic ocean governance measures. That is, measures that are not geographically fixed, like marine protected areas, but that can be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances. And the current frameworks just don't have the capacity to create these measures. So these impacts create a whole world of discussion for how we need to develop the ocean governance regime to address them. The second big area of contact between these topics is the role of oceans as an important carbon sink. We need to consider how to maintain and enhance the function of the ocean ecosystem as a carbon sink. And this has led to significant discussion under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and other international fora around the topic of blue carbon. And finally, climate change mitigation measures themselves may have impacts on ocean biodiversity and ocean governance. The deep seabed has been identified as a potential source of minerals and inputs to solar panels. And this has been used to support calls for deep seabed mining, with the argument that climate change is such a threat that it warrants the potential disaster that deep seabed mining could wreak on marine life. Geoengineering proposals like ocean fertilization have potentially uncertain consequences and potentially disastrous consequences for marine biodiversity. But currently, there are no legal frameworks for managing or regulating these new and emerging activities, again, some of which we don't even know what will look like.
Thanks very much, Lydia. So just pulling it out from a few of the things that you've said, we've got challenges where we have existing regional organizations that have been, some of which have been around for many years, that aren't really equipped to deal with the new issues that are created by climate change. Some might say we have some opportunities under things like the UN Framework Convention and discussions under the Framework Convention to discuss some of these new issues. But then there's kind of a gap where there's not really something in place right now that is specifically designed to handle some of the challenges of climate change. So this is really an area where we can see both challenges and opportunities. Stefan, what about in the areas that you focus on? How would you characterize the challenges and opportunities of international law in your research and areas of interest?
Yeah, polar regions are, of course, particularly affected by climate change. No part of the world is warming up faster than the Arctic, for example. And when we talk about the Arctic, it's often easy to just focus on the Arctic Ocean compared to the empty spaces, so say, of Antarctica. But the Arctic is not an empty space. It's home to many people. And the temperature rise brings a lot of direct, but also indirect effects for the Arctic communities. So the connection is actually there between the areas of the central Arctic Ocean and the surrounding Arctic. These effects, these direct and indirect effects, They can be numerous and they can have severe human rights implications. For example, with regard to the livelihoods of indigenous communities across the Arctic. We have a massive loss of biodiversity in some parts of the Arctic, while elsewhere there are new economic opportunities. At the same time, climate change leads to economic threats, for example, to infrastructure in the Arctic due to the loss of permafrost, which is a major issue for smaller communities, which cannot be reached by land anymore. Other problems which often appear to be national problems at first are things like the wildfires, which have been ravaging large parts of the Arctic, for example, last summer. Also, there's this mix now of traditional and non-traditional forms of land use. We have indigenous communities competing with mining companies or with tourism companies. And these trends, they're all being accelerated by climate change. Now, international law is one tool to help solve these problems by finding solutions which can apply to not just one part of the Arctic, but to the Arctic overall. This, of course, requires cooperation, and this cooperation is something which remains a challenge at this time. From the perspective of areas beyond national jurisdiction, Arctic shipping is, of course, a large topic of our time. There's this idea that there's saving potentials for shipping companies with a reduced distance for shipping when you connect, let's say, East Asia with Europe, going along the Northern Sea route along the Russian coast in the Arctic. But of course, that comes with major challenges. Just because there's less ice, it does not mean that Arctic shipping has become perfectly safe overnight. So there are residual threats. For example, the threat of accidents, of oil spills, all of which affects not only the Arctic marine environment, but also the people who live in the Arctic. Here we have seen already a few important steps. For example, the Polar Code, which entered into force in 2017, that's been a major step forward to protect not just human safety on board ships, but also the marine environment and the local communities. But this is just one step, and there's a need to regulate more, and often it's still not really clear what needs to be regulated because it's too early to tell which challenges will arise in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Stefan. If I could ask you just a follow-up question, and one of the areas that we're focusing on is unique use of international law as a vehicle to help promote change and stability in these areas beyond national jurisdiction. And you mentioned the Polar Code, which went into effect 3 years ago. Could you describe a little bit more about what type of an arrangement the Polar Code is? Would you describe it as hard law, soft law, as some people say, some combination of both?
The interesting thing about the Polar Code is that it's hard law now, but that actually has a long evolutionary history, really, starting with guidelines already decades ago. And there was a long process, starting from soft law suggestions to improve the seaworthiness of ships operating in polar waters, to what we have now within the framework of two international treaties, actually, MARPOL and SOLAS. MARPOL, a treaty which deals with the protection of the marine environment, and SOLAS, which is an old treaty dealing with the protection of human lives at sea. So we have two different regulatory areas, human safety in ships on one hand and the protection of the marine environment on the other hand. And within the framework of the International Maritime Organization, we now have one legal tool, a binding legal tool, which applies to all the states which have ratified either MARPOL or SOLAS. And the rules in the Polar Code, they now serve to increase the safety on ships and reduce the risk of pollution in the Arctic Ocean and, of course, in the waters around Antarctica.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, just staying on the topic of current events for a moment, we would be remiss without mentioning one of the topics that we all have been grappling with in one way or another for the past few months, which is the coronavirus epidemic. This epidemic has also raised some challenging international law questions in areas beyond national jurisdiction. For example, when several cruise ships at sea discovered that they had infected passengers and crew members on board, and they needed to figure out plans for returning to shore. Would either of you care to comment on any international law issues that you've seen raised by the coronavirus epidemic in areas beyond national jurisdiction? Maybe starting with Stefan this time.
Yeah, the coronavirus has been a serious problem and continues a serious problem, which is around the world, but also in industries which are often overlooked. We have many seafarers who basically keep globalization, keep international trade going, and a lot of these ships still operate right now. The cruise industry has been hit particularly hard by the coronavirus. From an infectious disease perspective, the cruise ship is a nearly ideal environment for the spread of the virus, which can be transferred from human to human. You have a large number of people on modern cruise ships, often thousands of passengers and crew members in basically a closed environment. You have people coming from many different parts of the world, visiting different cities or in countries in relatively short succession, meaning that potentially infected persons had the opportunity to be in different places during the incubation period without any chance to even know that they were infected. So that, of course, is a serious practical medical problem. From an international law perspective, we have the problem that the seafarers, the crew members, were protected insufficiently. The Maritime Labour Convention, for example, obliges all flag states to ensure that ships are a safe work environment, that there are occupational and health standards which are being met. With an infectious disease like COVID-19, that's of course extremely difficult to guarantee, let alone for the flag state to ensure with regard to ships which might be thousands of miles away from the flag state. In practice, a lot of the reaction to coronavirus has happened in ports. So the practical response came from the port states rather than the flag states. And this is something we certainly will have to see if international law needs to be developed further, or which tools can be created, if they don't exist yet, to make sure that both passengers and crew members are protected adequately, but also are treated with respect, for example, for their right to health if they are stranded far away from home.
Yeah. Thank you. Lydia, do you have comments on this topic?
Yes. I think one of the most interesting issues raised by COVID-19 with relevance to marine biodiversity is the international response to the pandemic, rather the lack of international response. Like the global oceans, we would think of a pandemic as a global issue that requires global cooperation to resolve, but that's not really what we've seen. Instead, at least from where I'm sitting, some of the most effective responses are not coming from an international legally established body or even from national institutions. They're coming from global social pressure to social distance, to shut down performances and events, to wear masks, to stay away from others who may be infected. And these activities, while socially shared, are based on internationally recognized scientific research. So I think this has some lessons for what we prioritize and how we think a new global ocean regime can work. First, clearly the importance of having solid scientific basis for all of the decision-making and governance, and sharing that science globally, not just with the decision makers, but with the general public. And second, possibly the limitations of international institutions to address a crisis, but also the potential for global action and global cooperation outside of legally established institutions to address a crisis.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, we often, as international lawyers, we focus on international legal mechanisms and institutions. But Lydia, you remind us that international cooperation can take place sometimes in spite of international institutions. And it's something that we need to be mindful of as we do work in this space, is to recognize kind of some of the limits and some of the opportunities. And that's kind of what one of the hypotheses that we're trying to test today in our panel. We're operating from what some might call a glass half full hypothesis, which is that increasing numbers of states engaged in increased activities in these areas beyond national jurisdiction, particularly the outer space and the oceans, I would say, is creating a dynamic space for international law. And dynamic space suggests changes to international law, which suggests some amount of consensus or cooperation among states regarding the need for changes and for development in international law. So Lydia, if I could turn to you again, taking your area of focus, which is the oceans, do you agree with this hypothesis? In other words, do you agree that there are increased numbers of states engaged in activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction? And is this activity creating challenges or opportunities in international law? Can you give us your perspective and maybe some examples of how this is playing out in what you follow?
Sure. I think there are certainly new types of activities that are becoming real in areas beyond national jurisdiction, like seabed mining, bioprospecting, and geoengineering, which I mentioned above. And in many cases, these activities are in their infancy. So I wouldn't necessarily say that large numbers of states are undertaking bioprospecting for genetic resources. But to some extent, that creates a problem of its own. First, we're in a position where we cannot see the future, but we kind of have a sense of where it's going. We know certain industries are going to develop, but we don't know exactly how the technology will develop or how the industries will develop. And so we need to create a global framework that can adapt and adjust and create the regulatory environment that's needed to preserve the marine ecosystem without fully knowing what direction the technology and the industry is going to take. I think the second big problem raised with by this fact that we have new emerging activities is that not all states are able to participate in them. So currently accessing the high seas and resources in the deep seabed requires significant financial and technological resources. Developed states may be able to take advantage of those resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. They may be able to fund research cruises and fund scientific expeditions. Developing states may be left behind because they may just lack the financial and technological capacity to engage in things like bioprospecting. And this has led to, I think, one of the central legal debates at the center of this new instrument on marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which I'll give some background to a bit later. And that legal debate is whether these deep sea biological resources are governed by freedom of the high seas or common heritage of humankind. If they're governed by the doctrine of freedom of the high seas, that would imply that any state can freely access and use the resources. If they're governed by common heritage of humankind, there would be an obligation for the benefits to be shared and used for the benefit of all humankind. This is a very important detail for developing countries, particularly because they see that these resources exist, they may potentially have high value, and they are not in a position to access them. Where we've arrived at is a general agreement that benefits from genetic resources from biodiversity in areas by national jurisdiction should be shared, whether that's because of the doctrine of common heritage of humankind or another reason. There's general consensus that benefits should be shared, but there's still a big debate on how benefits should be shared and to what extent they should be shared and to what extent they can be used for the benefit, for the exclusive benefit of the private entity or the state that accesses them.
That last point in particular, the idea of benefits to be shared by all versus kind of take what you can, to put it crudely, is an issue that comes up in many of the different disciplines that we followed in this signature topic. You know, there are states who just have more resources to exploit resources, to develop the tools needed to get to the high seas or to outer space. And I think it's interesting, and I'll actually ask for your comments, and Stefan's if you have them, on what you said, Lydia, that there's been an agreement, at least in the areas of the deep sea, that there is sharing of resources is the approach that is favored, even though we haven't yet figured out how we're going to do that. I mean, that kind of lends itself to the glass half full assessment of international law, that there are powerful states who actually say, we're going to share resources. You know, the answer is much more complicated than that, but I welcome your comments on this dichotomy between all for one for all, and, you know, take what you can.
Yeah. The element of benefit sharing has been part of the negotiation for many years, and it's been an element of debate for all of that time. So I would say that it's not necessarily that all states have agreed that they're going to share all the resources. I think there is consensus on involvement of various actors in accessing the resources through capacity building or through engaging with scientists or researchers from developing countries so they have the opportunity to participate. I think that kind of sharing of resources is very likely to be seen in the final agreement. Where we're having the big question, of course, is the issue of money, of where there is a profitable resource that's found, where a genetic resource leads to a significantly financially valuable product or invention. What are the obligations to share the revenue and the profit from that invention? And I think that's where we're seeing a very difficult divide.
Mm-hmm. Stefan, do you have any comments on, from your perspective on this issue?
We have a similar situation in the Arctic. We have often a question who actually gets to make decisions for the Arctic. And what is the debate on benefit sharing versus more individual approach elsewhere? In the Arctic, it becomes more for governance question with regard to the question who gets to participate in decision-making for the Arctic.
Right.
Keep in mind that the biggest part of the Arctic is not beyond national jurisdiction. Indeed, we have just the central Arctic Ocean, which is beyond national jurisdiction. Everything around is, in one way or another, be it land territory or territorial seas, or of course the exclusive economic zones of the coastal states, under some form of jurisdiction. And there we have the problem that in the Arctic, a lot of decisions for the people who live in the Arctic have been, for a long time, most of the time, have been made far outside the Arctic in national capital cities, which are far removed, not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of the lived reality of the decision makers, far removed from the everyday reality in the Arctic. So that is certainly a problem that in the Arctic you have to see it from a somewhat different perspective, always keeping in mind that you cannot really disconnect the areas beyond national jurisdiction from the people who actually live in the surrounding areas in the Arctic.
The theme of the practical impact of these areas beyond national jurisdiction on individuals is an interesting and important theme, because I think who's not following these issues may tend to think of areas beyond national jurisdiction in very abstract terms, but I think it's clearly true in many of these areas that there's a real life impact on individuals, on humans who are impacted in different ways by the decisions that states are taking in these spaces. I'd like to turn to some current examples of how international law is actually developing in some of these areas. And you both have mentioned some already, but maybe turning to an area where we haven't discussed much so far, which is outer space. Now, outer space is one area where many countries, including the United States, are already party to an international agreement called the Outer Space Treaty that governs some activities in this area beyond national jurisdiction. The Outer Space Treaty is actually relatively old as these things go. It's over 50 years old. Some describe it, it's a very general treaty in some ways. One of my colleagues describes it more as more constitutional than regulatory, and that it lays out very kind of high-level principles. And to put the more optimistic spin on it, leaves it to the states to decide how to implement things. Some things it leads to gaps that need to be filled. Stefan, in preparing for this panel, when we talked, you told me that you thought this was an exciting time for the development of law, international law in outer space. Can you explain a little bit your view on this topic?
Yeah. First of all, a lot of the treaty law we have in space law is relatively old. It was created mainly in what I would call the first space age. And it also reflects that specific time and the technology available at the time and the overall global political situation during the Cold War. What we are seeing today is suddenly, well, maybe not so much suddenly, but over time, a very new reality, practical reality when it comes to space operations. Today, we have far more private actors than was the case just a few years ago. Now, when the Outer Space Treaty and the other space law treaties were created, the idea of private space flight was theoretical at best. The space law did not end with the creation of the treaties and numerous UN resolutions dealing with very different matters of international space law. But overall, these norms, they're still from a different age, really, a different era. Today, private actors play a much bigger role, but this didn't happen overnight. There are a number of technological developments which make this easier today at this point in time. Increased computing power is one aspect, but for example, the availability of CubeSats, these standard satellites with this roughly 4x4 frames, that you have a standardized size for small satellites. The availability of satellite parts, which can be bought basically off the shelf today, that made things much cheaper. Today, you have university teams building small satellites for Earth observation, for example. That's something that 20 years ago would have been unthinkable, let alone at the time when these treaties were drafted. We have reusability, for example, with launch systems. That too allows a whole range of new actors and also a range of new activities, for example, large fleets of satellites. This also means that we need new forms of regulation because the rules we have today, they were not made with these possibilities in mind. Nobody really thought that it would be possible for a private company to own thousands of satellites or to send people to an international space station. Neither an international space station nor private space flight were much more than theory when the Outer Space Treaty was created. And at the same time, the treaties already looked a bit into the future. The Moon Treaty, for example, which applies not just to the moon, but to all celestial bodies in the solar system except Earth, that already was drafted in the 70s. There was already provision included to the effect that the parties to the Moon Treaty would have an obligation to create an international legal framework as soon as the exploitation of natural resources on other planets, on the moon, on asteroids, and so on, would be about to become feasible. So there was this idea that, okay, we don't have this situation now, but we can already imagine that this can become relevant. So the obligation included in the Moon Treaty was to create a new legal framework for this. And if we look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was created roughly around the same time as the Moon Treaty, we have Part 11 with the area, we have a very detailed legal system with institutions with rules on mining in the deep sea. In space law, we therefore have the complete opposite. We now are approaching the point where these things might become possible. Today, it might not be economically feasible, but now we see that this is something that could happen much faster than would have been thought, let's say, a decade or two ago. That also means that it's necessary to create new norms, because right now things are entirely unclear in this regard. One of the best analogies I've heard, for example, for asteroid mining is fishing. That you might have the right to fish, but you don't really have any rights to specific fish until you've caught it. Now, it's one thing to apply this rule to a relatively small operation with fishing vessels on the ocean, or if you fly to the moon or Mars or beyond. Just the thought that we would have to fall back on such analogies shows us that we really need clear regulation. But at the same time, we have the problem that the Moon Agreement, for example, has only been ratified by 18 countries. And all of the really interesting countries haven't ratified it. So it's not the US, not the major European countries, Russia, China, and so on. And at the same time, there's this trend that we want to have rules. If you make a major investment, if you're planning to fly to Mars or to the asteroid belt or engage in mining on the moon, of course you want to have a bit of legal certainty to protect your investment. So few countries, Luxembourg and the US, for example, have created national legislation to create a bit of legal certainty. At the same time, the Outer Space Treaty makes it actually illegal to exercise sovereignty. So here we have the problem that in order to give the companies some legal certainty, there have to be some kind of rules, but the rules that can be created under national law, they would then be basically a form of exercising sovereignty over another celestial body, which is outlawed by the Outer Space Treaty. So here we really have the opposite scenario when we, as compared to the deep sea bed, that things become possible, that people are planning for this kind of activity, but we don't have any rules yet. We don't know if the proposed Artemis Accords will ever be such a globally accepted legal framework or not. Right now, we have this huge gap in legislation or in lawmaking on international level, but it becomes clear that we are almost at the point in time when these activities, which to a lot of people still sound like science fiction, when they become actually practical reality. So I think that's why, yeah, that's a really exciting period, and we have a huge regulatory gap here.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Artemis Accords, Stefan. That was it's a U.S. Initiative to develop certain agreements between, I'd say, like-minded countries on some of the areas you've talked about. And this area of the outer space law is one where the current U.S. administration has actually been relatively active in articulating its own views. For example, President Trump issued an executive order a few months ago where the U.S. made clear that they do not believe the Moon Agreement reflects customary international law, among other things. And that's another area which is kind of interesting as we talk about areas beyond national jurisdiction, customary international law, and whether states agree that customary international law has developed sufficiently in some of these areas. But Lydia, I want to turn back to you because you've been critically involved in one of the most interesting ongoing multilateral international negotiations. And this is regarding the new treaty governing marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so for those of our viewers who are not deeply familiar, can you explain the background a bit and where we are in that process?
Yeah, certainly. The idea of developing a new international instrument on marine biodiversity in areas by national jurisdiction, this idea goes back a few decades. In 2015, the UN General Assembly set up a preparatory committee to consider the elements of a possible agreement, which would be an implementing agreement under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And then in 2018, on the basis of the report from that preparatory committee, the UN General Assembly convened an intergovernmental conference to negotiate the instrument. And that's where we are right now. The Intergovernmental Conference has met 3 times, and it was scheduled to meet a 4th and final time in April of this year. Of course, this meeting has now been pushed back to early 2021. The preparatory committee considered 4 elements of a possible implementing agreement, and those 4 elements are still the 4 elements that we are discussing in the current negotiations. They are environmental impact assessment, which would build on and create a detailed framework to support the environmental impact assessment obligations existing in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Provisions on area-based management tools, such as marine protected areas, and how those could work in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The questions around marine genetic resources and sharing of benefits from marine genetic resources, as I already mentioned. And finally, possibly most importantly, the issue of capacity building and technology transfer in relation to marine biodiversity. And this covers both capacity building and tech transfer to engage in activities in areas by national jurisdiction, as well as to implement the agreement and to ensure compliance with the final agreement. I think even before COVID-19, there was some question as to whether we would be able to conclude the negotiations in 2020, because there are still several difficult issues that need to be resolved. I think we're feeling right now a kind of 3-way tension between ambition and universality and time. That is, we want to get a strong and ambitious treaty with significant and enforceable obligations, but we also want to get to an agreement that every country can sign on to, ratify, and implement. And we don't have a lot of time, so we want to get something through as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's often when in multilateral negotiations like this, you really hit that's a great description of you want to cover as much as possible. You want to get something that's realistic for the key countries to sign on to, and you don't want the negotiations just to drag on indefinitely. It's really interesting to hear you describe the negotiations in that space right now. Now, you heard Stefan in the context of the outer space area talk about how there are gaps in the international framework, and one of the challenges is addressing those gaps. Would you describe the oceans as similar, that what we're trying to do is address gaps, or is it something else in your view?
No, absolutely. I think there's already a massive amount of law that applies to the ocean. From UN clause to the IMO agreements, to the FAO agreements, the regional seas conventions. So many people do ask, do we really need another agreement? And I think the response is that, yes, we do still have gaps, but we also have overlaps and we also have fragmentation. The existing frameworks are often either regional or sectoral, or in the case of UN clause, they lack specificity in terms of obligations or processes. Some concrete gaps that I could mention, I've already mentioned the inability to account for cumulative impacts of fishing, shipping, seabed mining, climate change, and other pressures from different sectors and from emerging sectors. The new instrument would provide for environmental impact assessments, which hopefully would need to take into consideration these cumulative impacts, and also area-based measures like marine protected areas, which could assess and coordinate multiple measures applied to the same ecosystem. Another gap that I want to mention is marine genetic resources are strikingly absent from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The provisions on the deep seabed explicitly define resources as mineral resources. And many jurists have taken this to mean that genetic resources are excluded, which means that right now we have a system for managing mineral resource exploitation, but nothing whatsoever on genetic resources.
Interesting. Now, going back to the theme of our panel, the dynamism in international law, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. We all hear this as international lawyers sometimes. Much as a surgeon favors surgery, sometimes international lawyers are accused of favoring international agreements and formal international agreements as a solution for all problems within international law dimension. And I'd like to turn to each of you to talk about an area where you believe that something short of a formal treaty or other formal international agreement could help resolve a current gap or dispute or similar issue. Maybe starting with you, Stefan.
In the Arctic, we actually have something somewhat to that extent. Sure, I have to admit that as a lawyer, I probably would always prefer the clear binding nature of an international treaty. I think this is in international law, this is simply the tool that many lawyers are probably most comfortable with. Nevertheless, there can be many opportunities where something less than a treaty can have a positive impact. For example, in the Arctic, we have the Arctic Council, which brings together not just the Arctic nations, but also representatives of indigenous organizations. And the Arctic Council works, for a long time, is working with a lot of guidelines on different issues. And it's only in recent years that this has been turned into international treaties. Now, the Arctic Council turned itself into a forum for the Arctic states to negotiate international treaties with relevance for the Arctic. So it's a classical international, not a supranational institution. These treaties cover, for example, oil spills in the Arctic, search and rescue operations in the Arctic, or scientific cooperation. I believe that these treaties would not have been possible without a lot of work in the soft law area before that. One of the reasons for that is that in the Arctic, and the same can be said of Antarctica and also outer space, we have cooperation which crosses political divides. Countries which, in other circumstances, would not want to cooperate with each other for political reasons are much more likely to cooperate in these areas which are seen as still somewhat dangerous or hard to access. You have an increased risk for human life when you operate, let's say, in Antarctica, or when you engage in space operations, when you do research in the Arctic. It's this enhanced risk, but also the relative lack of actors. You have a relatively small number of states involved, which makes it easier also to cross political divides and to come to solutions. Now, often these solutions will not be in the form of hard law, in the form of an international treaty. Yet, nevertheless, guidelines have the benefit of being often much more acceptable for political purposes. And that's something which, especially in the Arctic, is something that should not be underestimated. Especially keeping in mind that the key player in the Arctic, of course, remains the Russian Federation, which has not had the best political relationship with other countries in the Arctic for a long time. Nevertheless, cooperation across borders is a daily reality for people in the Arctic, for people working in governance in different Arctic countries. Here, soft law can really play an important role to cross these political divides, but also to bring tangible results, which later can actually become hard law. And we've seen this also in the Polar Code. As I said earlier, the Polar Code did not come out of nothing. It's the end result of a long development. And this development started with soft law. So I believe soft law does have a role in these circumstances. It might be as a stepping stone towards an international treaty, but in some circumstances, it might also be enough to just have soft law. The same can be said of voluntary contributions or voluntary decisions. For example, last year, the Association of Arctic Expedition Operators, cruise ship operators in the Arctic, the members of that organization decided we are not going to use heavy fuel oil in the Arctic anymore. There's been a long discussion about heavy fuel oil in the Arctic because it's the Arctic Ocean is rather vulnerable. It's technically next to impossible to clean up an oil spill in the Arctic. You might be familiar, of course, with the Exxon Valdez incident, and oil from the Exxon Valdez was actually found in tidal pools in the area, the coast of Alaska, 25 years later. And that was not even in the high Arctic, really near to the Arctic. The specific characteristics of the Arctic Ocean mean that oil spills are much worse there. Refraining from using heavy fuel oil in the Arctic is an important step. And that this happened voluntarily, it also makes it much easier to continue this debate. Heavy fuel oil, for example, is something that a lot of local communities in the Arctic still rely on. In many parts of Greenland, for example, you need ships to transport food. Having to use cleaner fuel would mean higher fuel prices, would mean higher costs for food. Especially in the remote parts of Greenland, that would lead to a lot of opposition. So, and of course, a lot of practical problems for the communities there, especially those far-flung communities like Kanak in the far north of Greenland, which are very dependent on food imports. So there's also real social side here. In such situations, these soft law or voluntary activities by industry associations like the ACO, it can make an important contribution to actually solving a problem for which we don't really have a consensus or enough of a consensus for an international treaty.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. And same question for you, Lydia. Where do you see voluntary cooperation, or as Stefan says, soft law, potentially solving problems in the oceans?
Yeah. Well, I'll give two examples. I really like the point about soft law moving towards hard law, and I hope that's what we're seeing now in regards to marine biodiversity in the high seas. For example, we have organizations like the Sargasso Sea Alliance and the Sargasso Sea Commission, which exist in the absence of an international legal framework for marine protected areas. but seek to work to protect a specific area which partly lies beyond national jurisdiction, which is the Sargasso Sea. And they do it by working with existing sectoral organizations like the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, IMO, and ISA, to put in place measures within each of those respective sectors to protect the Sargasso Sea. Now, they're having some measure of success, but their job and the creation of other similar areas would be just fantastically facilitated and catalyzed and supported by the framework that we are developing under the BBNJ agreement itself. So I think in that example, we do see that we have this current model of how you can do this without the international agreement, without the global agreement. And that model is actually helping inform the development of the agreement. So I hope we're going to see this move from the more soft law to the hard law, or at least from the more regional example to a global example. The other example I want to give is one where I think it is going to be very difficult to regulate through hard law legal mechanisms. Stefan mentioned cube satellites and how university students can build satellites around the world now. A similar thing is happening with regards to genetic research. You might have heard of DIY biology, do-it-yourself biology. There's a global movement which enables university students, even high school students, private researchers, community labs working in their own garages or in a community laboratory space to do genetic research, to develop genetically engineered machines, genetically engineered organisms that could solve various problems that are confronting the world today. This form of genetic research is a little bit terrifying to many people because it's very hard to regulate, since it is DIY. It is happening in garages rather than necessarily in government-funded laboratories. And it potentially has impacts on marine biodiversity, or it might use genetic resources that come from the deep sea ocean environment. And how would you trace that? And I think one answer that we're going to have to rely on for no other alternative is the industry standards created by the DIY biology community itself. One organization, IGEM, which stands for International Genetically Engineered Machines, has an international competition of high school students and university students, but it's also come up with a quite detailed set of guidelines for biosafety and for good conduct in using genetic resources. And I think that kind of industry standard we're going to need to rely on in some of these technologies where the only ones who really know how to manage the technology are the ones who are using it for doing the work.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, and one of the themes that I've heard throughout this discussion is how private actors, the person in one's garage who's doing DIY biology, to the fisheries and cruise ships, really are taking a lot of the activity that is both interesting and challenging in these spaces we've talked about. In outer space, we had SpaceX doing the first launch from U.S. soil in, I think, almost 10 years a few weeks ago. Oceans, Lydia, you mentioned that the deep sea resource exploitation is an area where private industry could well be involved at some point in the near future. So, Lydia, just starting with you, do you think we need new or different legal mechanisms to better account for the fact that private parties are so integral in what's going on in areas beyond national jurisdiction?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the big criticisms of the current global ocean governance regime is the reliance on flag states, with the argument that flags of convenience exist, which are states that are unable or unwilling to control the actions of vessels flying their flag. And this has led to, I think, a larger scale movement to go beyond flag state jurisdiction and think about other forms of control a state can exercise over private entities, whether that's control over its own citizens and nationals, which is provided in the context of deep seabed mining, control over corporations registered or doing business in the state, ports, port state measures, control over resources coming into the port, or control over its own markets. And this could take the form of a law like the United States Lacey Act that criminalizes import or trade of illegally sourced wildlife products, including illegally sourced fish. In the context of genetic resources, we're also seeing this. The Nagoya Protocol, which covers genetic resources accessed within national jurisdiction, creates an obligation for state parties to take measures to provide that genetic resources used within that state, including used by private researchers within that state, were accessed in accordance with the protocol. And I think the new agreement on BBNJ will need to include something equivalent, if not stronger, to require parties to adopt mechanisms to make sure that private actors using genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction follow the required procedures, particularly in terms of benefit sharing. And as I've said, tracing the origin of genetic resources is going to be very, very difficult. But there are various ways that they can do this, including through disclosure of origin requirements at the point of patenting, or through benefit sharing and reporting requirements tied to public research funds.
Interesting. And Stefan, I turn to you with the same question, but maybe focusing on compliance, which is another area that international lawyers struggle with in various ways when you're talking about states. How does international law, or how can it induce compliance by private parties in these areas? Interested in your views on that.
Compliance is, of course, a huge problem. For example, when we think about ships operating on the high seas, it's difficult for the flag state to ensure compliance. But we have an even bigger problem when we think of operations in outer space. Very often there's this thought, of course, you're far away from your home state, from your flag state, from the state where your spacecraft is registered in. So it's difficult for the state to actually ensure compliance. But there are basically two ways to do that. The first one would be to have a permit procedure, meaning that you impose a minimum standard that has to be fulfilled before you're allowed to start any activity, be that ship operations or space operations, whatever it is. The other option is to have regular controls while these operations are happening. Lydia mentioned port state controls. Port state controls are a vital instrument to ensure compliance of ships with international standards that the flag states have agreed to, even when the ships are far away from the flag state, especially if you use a flag of convenience and operate in a totally different part of the world. In outer space, for a long time, space operations have been run by governments, and they've usually, until the space shuttle system, they've been single-use items. What we see now is more and more focus on reusability. We see a spacecraft which will fly again and again. And I think it's certainly possible that in the long run, we'll also have for the space industry something similar to the port state control system we have for ships today, especially as spacecraft are going to travel more frequently, there will be more reusability. Reusability will become the new normal eventually. So spacecraft will come back to Earth, fly back out to the space station, to the moon, Mars, and so on. So maybe this might be an area where the law of the sea will once more serve as a role model, or at least an inspiration for the development of space law.
Well, on that note, which is a truly dynamic note from both of you, we've come to the end of our hour, which means we've come to the end of our panel, which means we've concluded ASIL's consideration of this signature topic. And I'd really like to thank each of you for your participation today and this really interesting discussion. I would also like to thank Professor Payne for your work in leading the steering committee overseeing this topic. And I'd like to encourage all of you who are watching us, but particularly students, to get involved in these topics. These are great topics. They're full of interesting, dynamic issues. Follow the BBNJ negotiations with Lydia. Contact any of us. I think international law in these areas is truly dynamic. Hopefully you've heard it is creative, and in the words of both of our panelists, it is exciting. Thank you very much.